What if the next wide-body competitor to the Boeing 787 doesn't come from Seattle or Toulouse, but from Shanghai? No, there hasn't been a dramatic fleet swap. No airline has publicly abandoned the Dreamliner overnight. But something quieter is happening. The COMAC C929 is starting to appear in strategic discussions, not as a replacement today, but as leverage for tomorrow. So who is really backing this aircraft, and could its emergence quietly reshape the balance of power in the wide-body market? Let's break it down properly, because this story is bigger than a single airplane. Let's start with the basics of why this conversation is even happening in the first place. It doesn't begin with an engineering breakthrough or a dramatic order announcement. It begins with scale. China is widely projected to become the world's largest aviation market over the coming decades. That's not a marginal shift. It's a structural one. It's driven by sustained middle-class expansion, rapid urbanization, growing, domestic connectivity demand between second and third-tier cities, and a steady rise in long-haul international travel, as more Chinese travelers go abroad for business and leisure. When you put those trends together, you get a market that isn't just large, it's expanding on almost every axis at once. More routes, more frequencies, more passengers, and more premium demand. That projection alone changes how aircraft decisions are framed inside Chinese boardrooms. When your home market is expected to generate a significant share of future wide-body demand globally, domestic demand stops being just a customer base. It becomes leverage. And that leverage reshapes fleet strategy, because now the question isn't only which aircraft performs best, it's which aircraft best serves our long-term national and commercial interests. That's a fundamentally different question, and it's one that Western manufacturers don't usually have to answer in quite the same way. This is where the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, better known as COMAC, enters the picture with the C929 wide-body program. The aircraft itself is still in development. It hasn't flown commercially, it hasn't been certified by international regulators, and there's no fleet of them anywhere in the world today. But the strategic context around it is already influential, and that's an important distinction to hold on to throughout this whole discussion. The plane doesn't need to exist yet for its existence to matter strategically. The Chinese government has made it clear, repeatedly and consistently, that developing a competitive domestic aerospace industry is a long-term national priority. This isn't a side project or a vanity program. Industrial policy, state-backed financing structures, regulatory coordination between Chinese aviation authorities, and deliberate supply chain localization efforts all point in the same direction, reducing structural dependence on Western aerospace suppliers over time. Every one of those levers, on its own, might seem incremental. Together, they represent a coordinated long-horizon strategy. For Chinese carriers, evaluating the C929 is therefore not simply a question of fuel burn or seat count, the way it might be for an airline in Europe or North America comparing two competing jets. It can also represent alignment with national industrial objectives. That doesn't mean airlines ignore economics entirely. They still have to run a profitable operation. It means the economics are evaluated within a broader framework that includes political alignment, access to capital, and long-term partnership positioning with the state. A domestic wide-body program offers the potential for financing terms shaped by state support, training ecosystems built around and aligned with local regulators, and a development roadmap designed around domestic network priorities rather than global export markets first. That combination carries real weight, especially in a market expected to expand significantly beyond China's own borders in the coming years. There's another layer worth considering here, and it's one that often gets overlooked. Some emerging market carriers outside China may look at the aircraft through a completely different lens. If pricing strategies and financing packages are structured competitively enough, a new entrant like the C929 could become genuinely attractive in regions where capital costs are high and access to traditional Western financing channels is constrained or expensive. Think about carriers in parts of Africa, Central Asia, or Southeast Asia that have historically struggled to secure the kind of favorable financing terms that flag carriers in wealthier regions take for granted. For them, a state-backed Chinese financing package tied to aircraft delivery could be a meaningfully different value proposition. In that sense, the C929 is not just an aircraft project sitting on an engineering roadmap somewhere in Shanghai. It is part of a broader effort to reposition China within the global aerospace hierarchy, shifting it from being primarily a customer and assembly hub for Western aircraft to being a credible manufacturer and exporter in its own right. None of this implies that airlines are abandoning established platforms overnight, and it's worth being very clear about that, because it would be easy to overstate the current moment. It does, however, explain why these conversations are happening at all, quietly, in strategy meetings and industry panels, even without headline-grabbing orders. When a country projects to dominate future demand and simultaneously invests heavily in its own wide-body capability, airlines within that ecosystem will at least evaluate the option, even if they don't act on it immediately. Moreover, the program represents strategic alignment, industrial ambition, and potential pricing leverage. Three things that matter a great deal in long-term fleet planning even before a single unit is delivered. Whether that consideration ultimately translates into large-scale international adoption is a separate question entirely, and one we genuinely don't have the answer to yet. But the fact that it is being seriously discussed at all in boardrooms, in government policy circles, and increasingly in aviation media reflects a shifting balance of market power and industrial confidence that didn't exist in quite the same way a decade ago. Now, if you were running a major Asian airline today, would you seriously evaluate the C929 as part of your future fleet planning? It's worth sitting with that question for a moment, because the answer probably depends heavily on where your airline is based, who your government relationships look like, and how exposed you already are to Western versus Chinese supply chains. That strategic context explains why airlines are willing to look at the program at all. But once you move from geopolitics to engineering, the natural next question is, what would actually make the C929 a legitimate alternative to the Boeing 787, rather than just a symbolic gesture of independence? On paper, the comparison is deliberate, and COMAC has clearly designed this aircraft with the 787 in mind as a direct reference point. The COMAC widebody is designed to compete in the same general segment as the Dreamliner, targeting long-haul, twin-aisle operations with a broadly similar passenger capacity in the low to mid-300s depending on configuration. This isn't a coincidence. It's a calculated positioning decision meant to slot the C929 directly into the same fleet planning conversations, where the 787 currently dominates. Projected range figures for the C929 have been discussed in the range of roughly 10,000 to 12,000 kilometers, depending on the specific configuration and payload, while the 787 family can reach roughly 14,000 kilometers in its longest range variants. That gap matters quite a bit for ultra-long-haul missions, the kind of routes that connect, say, a major Asian hub directly to the east coast of North America, or to parts of South America without a stop. But for many regional and mid-range intercontinental routes, which actually make up the bulk of global wide-body flying, the planned C929 range would theoretically be more than sufficient. Cabin width is another area where the C929 aims to differentiate itself, with early design discussions pointing to a slightly wider cross-section than the 787. A wider cabin can translate into either more comfortable seating configurations or the ability to fit an extra seat per row in economy, both of which matter to airlines thinking about unit economics and to passengers thinking about comfort on long flights. Composite usage is also comparable in ambition, with roughly 50% of the airframe expected to rely on advanced composite materials. That mirrors the structural philosophy that helped define the Dreamliner's efficiency profile in the first place: lighter airframes, better fuel burn, and reduced maintenance related to metal fatigue over the life of the aircraft. It's a clear sign that COMAC studied the 787 program closely and is trying to replicate its structural advantages rather than reinvent the approach from scratch. On the propulsion side, though, the contrast becomes much sharper, and this is really where the two programs diverge in terms of maturity. The 787 operates with established engine platforms, specifically the GE GenX and the Rolls-Royce Trent 1000, both of which are supported by mature global maintenance networks and years, in some cases well over a decade, of accumulated operational data across airlines worldwide. Every failure mode, every maintenance interval, every performance quirk of these engines has been studied, documented, and refined through real-world use. COMAC's long-term plan, on the other hand, includes a domestically developed engine, still in development, intended to reduce reliance on Western suppliers entirely. If that engine reaches its performance and reliability targets, it would represent a genuinely significant industrial milestone for China's aerospace ambitions, arguably a bigger deal than the airframe itself, because engines are widely considered one of the hardest parts of aircraft manufacturing to master. But this is exactly where credibility matters most. On paper does not equal operational equivalence, and nowhere is that gap wider than in propulsion systems. Certification timelines for the C929 remain undefined, and the aircraft is not yet in commercial service anywhere. Supply chain maturity, global maintenance, repair, and overhaul infrastructure, dispatch reliability rates, and residual value stability in the secondary market are not theoretical details that can be waved away with good engineering specs. They are central to airline decision-making at the most practical level, the level where fleet planners and CFOs actually sign contracts. The Boeing Dreamliner has accumulated millions of flight hours across nearly every climate and operating condition on the planet, built a worldwide support ecosystem spanning dozens of countries, and established predictable performance metrics that airlines can model with a high degree of confidence. The C929, by contrast, remains a development program, even if its design specifications align closely with the 787 in terms of range, materials, and cabin architecture on paper. Airlines evaluate more than performance charts when they make fleet decisions of this magnitude. They assess life cycle cost certainty over 20 or more years of operation, training infrastructure for pilots and maintenance crews, parts availability across their route network, and financing confidence from banks and lessors who need to be comfortable with the asset's long-term value. Questions about Western component exposure also remain relevant here, particularly given ongoing geopolitical sensitivities around export controls and the practical challenges of certification reciprocity between Chinese and Western aviation authorities. If the C929 depends on components subject to export restrictions, that creates a whole additional layer of risk that airlines have to price into their decision. So while the jet positions itself clearly within the same competitive frame as the 787 today, at least on paper, it represents a competitor on paper versus a proven aircraft in operation. The technical ambition is genuinely evident throughout the program, and the structural and performance goals are aligned with modern wide-body expectations in almost every respect. But bridging the gap between specification sheet and sustained commercial reliability is a process measured not in press releases or announcements, but in years, sometimes decades, of accumulated operational proof. But this is exactly where the comparison shifts from engineering ambition to commercial reality, and this shift is really the heart of why the 787 continues to dominate. Because when airline executives sit down in a boardroom to make a fleet decision worth billions of dollars, they are not buying specifications off a brochure. They are buying certainty, predictability, and reduced risk across every dimension of their operation. And that is why most carriers today still choose the Boeing 787 over any emerging alternative. The 787 is no longer a concept, no longer a development program, and no longer an aircraft proving itself in early service the way it was back when it first entered commercial operation. It has accumulated millions of flight hours across continents, climates, and operating conditions, from the heat of the Middle East to the cold of northern routes to the humidity of Southeast Asia. That operational history translates directly into fuel burn data, maintenance interval data, dispatch reliability rates, and real-world performance metrics that CFOs and fleet planners can model with genuine precision rather than educated guesswork. Predictability is currency in aviation, arguably the single most valuable currency in the entire industry. And the Dreamliner has earned an enormous amount of it over the years. Beyond flight hours, there's the global maintenance, repair, and overhaul ecosystem that has grown up around the aircraft. A mature MRO network means parts availability across virtually every region an airline might operate in. Certified technicians, trained and available worldwide, established repair cycles that minimize aircraft downtime, and the ability to support the aircraft efficiently even when it operates far from its home base. That infrastructure lowers operational risk substantially. It reduces unplanned downtime, it protects schedule integrity, which matters enormously to airlines trying to maintain on-time performance and passenger satisfaction. Then there's financing, which is often underappreciated in these conversations, but is absolutely critical. Aircraft are not purchased in isolation the way a consumer might buy a car. They are financial instruments as much as they are transportation assets, often financed through complex arrangements involving lessors, banks, and export credit agencies over periods of 15 to 20 years or more. The Dreamliner benefits from established relationships with lessors, export credit agencies, and commercial banks that have decades of experience financing Boeing aircraft. Its resale value is visible, benchmarked against years of transaction data, and widely understood in the secondary market. That liquidity matters enormously. When an airline orders a 787, it knows there is a global pool of potential operators who might want to buy or lease that aircraft down the line. If fleet strategy changes, that reduces long-term exposure and risk. Investors understand this dynamic well. Leasing companies price their deals accordingly, often offering more favorable terms because the underlying asset carries less uncertainty. Choosing the aircraft, in other words, is fundamentally a business decision grounded in risk management as much as it is about performance or ambition. It reflects decades of ecosystem development, regulatory validation across multiple jurisdictions, and hard-won operational maturity that simply cannot be replicated overnight, no matter how much capital or political will is behind a program. By contrast, choosing the C929 today would be a strategic gamble, and it's important to be precise about why. Not because the concept lacks ambition, clearly it doesn't, but because the surrounding ecosystem does not yet exist at global scale. Certification pathways across borders, regulatory acceptance in markets outside China, maintenance infrastructure outside China's own borders, resale benchmarks in the secondary market, and long-term financing frameworks with international banks and lessors all remain uncertain and largely untested. Airlines do not just evaluate performance charts when making decisions like this, they evaluate exposure across every possible scenario. They ask how an aircraft behaves during economic downturns, when fleets need to be trimmed and older or less liquid aircraft become a liability. They ask how it performs in resale markets, whether there's a buyer if they need to offload it. They ask how easily it can be financed on favorable terms. And they ask how quickly it can be supported if technical issues arise mid-operation, particularly on a long-haul flight far from a maintenance base. The 787 answers all of those questions with historical evidence accumulated over more than a decade of commercial service. The C929 can currently only answer them with projections and promises. That difference is decisive for most airlines making decisions today. For most global carriers, the safer path remains the proven one, and that's unlikely to change quickly, no matter how much progress COMAC makes on the engineering side. The Dreamliner represents reliability, not just in flight, in the literal sense of getting passengers from point A to point B safely and on time, but in capital markets and operational networks as well. And in an industry where margins are notoriously thin and volatility, from fuel price swings to pandemics to geopolitical shocks, is a near constant feature of the business. Proven reliability often outweighs strategic experimentation, even when that experimentation carries the promise of long-term independence or cost savings. The Dreamliner isn't just an aircraft platform at this point. It's a fully developed financial and operational ecosystem that took Boeing, its suppliers, and its airline customers years to build together. So, given all of this, who has actually bought the C929 instead of the 787? The short answer is straightforward. No one has replaced their Dreamliners because of the C929. There has been no Western airline pivot away from the 787, and no surprise cancellation wave triggered by the emergence of a Chinese alternative. What we're seeing instead is something more subtle and arguably more interesting, which is domestic alignment inside China itself. State-influenced carriers such as Air China and China Eastern have signaled long-term support for the program, not as a market rebellion against Western manufacturers, but as part of a coordinated national aerospace roadmap that's been in motion for years. And that distinction changes how we should interpret the headlines when they do appear. Because the real story here isn't about a signature on a purchase contract, at least not yet. The real story is about strategic alignment building quietly in the background. Airlines, particularly those operating in regions economically tied to China through trade, infrastructure investment, or political relationships, are evaluating what a third wide-body manufacturer could mean for leverage, resilience, and long-term independence from what has essentially been a two-player system dominated by Boeing and Airbus for decades. Even if no one has replaced their existing 787 fleet with C929s, the mere existence of a credible alternative on the horizon shifts the negotiating dynamic in subtle but meaningful ways. When manufacturers know there's another option emerging, even years away from full maturity, pricing pressure changes in negotiations. Delivery slot discussions change because airlines have a fallback, however distant, in their back pocket. Industrial partnerships change as suppliers hedge their bets across multiple programs. That alone has a real impact on how the entire industry negotiates, even before a single C929 enters revenue service. It's also worth remembering that COMAC isn't walking into this cold. The C919, its narrow-body program aimed squarely at the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 families, has already entered commercial service with Chinese carriers and has been steadily ramping up production. That program gave COMAC something valuable beyond engineering data. It gave them a working relationship with domestic regulators, early lessons in supply chain management at scale, and a template for how to move a Chinese-designed jet from prototype to paying passengers. None of that guarantees success with a wide-body, which is a much more complex undertaking in almost every respect, from structural loads to long-haul systems, redundancy to international certification requirements. But it does mean the C929 isn't starting from zero institutional experience the way a brand new manufacturer might. There's a learning curve already climbed, even if the summit ahead is considerably higher. It's also worth thinking about the human infrastructure side of this equation, something that doesn't always make it into the headlines, but matters enormously in practice. Building a wide body isn't only about engineering the airframe and the engines, it's about training an entire generation of engineers, technicians, and program managers capable of sustaining a manufacturing effort over decades. China has been investing heavily in exactly that kind of talent pipeline, through university partnerships, joint ventures with international suppliers who still participate in various subsystems, and deliberate knowledge transfer arrangements. That's a slower, less visible form of progress than a flashy prototype rollout, but it's arguably more important for the program's long-term viability, because institutional knowledge is what actually sustains an aerospace program once the initial excitement fades and the hard, grinding work of certification and production ramp-up begins. Now, zoom out and think about the bigger picture here. For decades, the global wide-body structure has revolved around two giants, Boeing and Airbus, effectively splitting the market between them with occasional competition from smaller regional programs that never quite broke into the wide-body space in a serious way. The question now is whether geopolitical gravity will slowly pull parts of the market into new lanes over the coming decades. Could we see a future where parts of Asia, Africa, or the Middle East increasingly align with a China-centered aerospace ecosystem, drawn in by favorable financing, political relationships, and the pull of proximity to a growing manufacturing base? At the same time, could North America and Europe remain firmly anchored to Boeing and Airbus, reinforced by decades of institutional relationships, existing infrastructure, and deeper political and economic ties? If that kind of bifurcation happens, the industry doesn't just gain a competitor in the traditional sense, it fundamentally restructures around 3 centers of gravity instead of 2. Over the next 10 years or so, we may either see the Airbus-Boeing duopoly reinforced as the safer, proven choice continues to dominate global fleet decisions, or we may witness the gradual rise of a third pillar in commercial aviation, shaped as much by politics, industrial policy, and long-term national strategy as by raw aircraft performance or cost per seat mile. Both outcomes are plausible, and honestly, the answer probably won't be uniform across every region of the world. It may well be a mixed picture, depending on where you look. And that's really why this moment matters, even though it might not look like much is happening on the surface today. The battle for the future of wide-body aviation hasn't started in the skies yet. There isn't a single C929 carrying paying passengers anywhere in the world as of now. But the groundwork, the financing structures, the political alignment, the industrial policy, and the quiet conversations happening inside airline strategy departments are already well underway. By the time this competition does show up visibly in the skies, in the form of actual delivered aircraft flying real routes, the strategic positioning that determines who wins and loses will already have been largely decided behind closed doors. If you were running a major Asian airline today, would you seriously evaluate the C929 as part of your future fleet strategy, knowing everything we've just walked through about its promise and its risks? Let me know what you think. And if you found this breakdown useful, consider sticking around, because this is a story that's only going to get more interesting as the decade goes on.